All right, welcome everybody around the world. Welcome to all my subscribers. I'm going to try and squeeze all of this into a short time frame because I don't have much time. I aim to get maybe another 15, 20% or so more material evidence and, narration, worded out and everything for the final form of this presentation. So what we have today is not the total absolute final form. I will have a little bit more evidence with it and a more complete narration for it. A narration, just in, having written down the introspective, the analysis, and the argument. So it's you don't always have to make it up off the top of your head, right? That's what I mean by the narration. So I already know going into this that very few will see my video. It's very unlikely that a member of Judaism or a rabbi will come across this video, and it's further unlikely that they will listen to it or take it seriously. So the odds of a rabbi or a member of Judaism even listening to everything what I have to say in this one video is highly unlikely. Still doing it. I personally don't really care if they don't believe. Even after hearing my evidence, I really don't care. I'm not doing this because I feel compelled to convert them or missionize them or anything like that. There isn't really anything to convert away from. Uh, anyways, so unique here. Also, I'm Unitarian. I don't want to spend more time explaining that, but not Trinitarian. I don't believe Jesus was God. I don't believe that he was a sacrifice, and so forth. It's in my systematic theology, the original Christianity. So, anyways, what I'll do here today is just read through what I've got so far in terms of the evidence stitched together with narration to explain it. So, what I'm going to do is just read through that. Um, Hopefully, I won't need to intervene and say much in between. And hopefully, if I just read what I have here without waffling, I can get through all of this material at least for this presentation. So, let us begin. So, it's just simply titled Proof for Judaism that Jesus is the Messiah. So, for this presentation and study, no New Testament scripture is used whatsoever, only the Tanakh is used. One good thing that would make Judaism and the rabbis happy to hear. Entirely Tanakh, nothing from the New Testament whatsoever. And also for this project, I focused on the most core and critical matters pertaining to the topic at hand, not on more petty matters that do not or cannot truly prove whether Jesus was Messiah, contrary to what other Christians may think. Things such as him being born in Bethlehem, his resurrection, his miracles, Psalm 110, and so forth. I don't get into those petty matters because they don't actually prove whether Jesus was Messiah or not. Any member of Judaism would know this. Christians would be the ones to argue with me, ironically, on this. But it's a fact. You cannot prove, they do not prove, that does not prove that Jesus was Messiah. So I'm focusing on the more core and critical matters here that would prove that Jesus was Messiah. Anyways, going on, any other theological debate, and there are relevant ones, anybody from Judaism would say, oh, well, we'd need to debate on whether Jesus changed the law, whether he defied it, and all those things, right? That's what I'm talking about here. Any other theological debate can be settled by the evidence in my systematic theology. That's for another time. I'm not adding hours onto this video, right? But for a more grand argument, for Jesus being Messiah, you would also have to argue that side of things to do with theology. I already dealt with that, so to speak, with my systematic theology, which is why I'm referencing it here, right? So any other theological debate can be settled by the evidence in my systematic theology, i.e., that Jesus reinforced what was, i.e., the law of Judaism and all that. That Jesus actually, I can prove that Jesus reinforced what was, and that he did not defy or create anything new or replace anything. So I can prove that, and I'm confident that I can prove this to Judaism using my systematic theology, which would mean that the only remaining argument would be as to how Jesus could be Messiah, relying on the few following things. Okay, so even if they listened, they learned from my systematic theology They shake my hand and say, okay, fine, Jesus didn't defy anything. He did reinforce what was Judaism for Jews, Gentile law for Gentiles. He taught reformation from sin, turn to God, and all that, right? They might shake my hand and agree on all that, but they would still say, well, there's a few problems that we have to make us question whether still Jesus could be Messiah. I mean, the fact that Jesus didn't bring anything new and didn't define anything, that doesn't prove whether he was Messiah or not. That's irrelevant to whether he's Messiah or not. But if he is Messiah, he would have to adhere to those things. So the evidence in my systematic theology, in turn, will show that, yes, Jesus didn't defy anything. So he's not disqualified from being Messiah because he didn't defy anything or replace anything or and all that. That's my point. And what I mean by the only remaining argument to Jesus being Messiah would be the following questions. That's what I mean, right? So the following questions are: why did Jesus come when he did so long before the end days, right? He came like 2,000 years ago. Why did he come then? That's one of the remaining questions that would be. Okay. And in short, as I will show with the evidence, Messiah was said to appear before the fall of Israel, which we know historically was in 70 AD. Okay. The next great question that remains to be answered is, why did he die? Why did Jesus die if he was the Messiah? Okay. And in short, the answer is because he was opposed. That's the reason why he died, because he was opposed unto his death. But his death was also foretold, as I will show. And furthermore, death does not disqualify one from being the Messiah, according to Tanakh. Tanakh doesn't say anywhere that if you die, you're disqualified from being Messiah. Okay. And like I said, on the contrary, I can show that Messiah was foretold to die. Okay. But going on, the next great question that remains is, then why did Jesus not attain in his lifetime the restoration of Israel, the ingathering of Israel, the world peace, and the world rule? This is one of the biggest questions that Judaism always throws out at Christianity. Oh, Jesus isn't the Messiah because he didn't do those things in his lifetime. You claim he's going to do them at the end of days. This is the standard Jewish response to a Christian, argument, right? And oops, sorry, screensaver. All right. Um, But in short, for now, as I will show with the evidence, Israel was still standing in Jesus's day. So it was already standing. So you couldn't restore it if it's standing. And it was about to fall, as we historically know, just 40 years after his death, right? So for those two good reasons, it was not to be restored at that time, right? So whether Jesus was Messiah or not, okay, the simple fact is it was standing at that time and was about to fall. So that was not the time in history for Israel to be restored, right? However, as I will show later, Jesus did, and it sounds crazy at first, but it's not when you hear it explained, or it'll make sense when I explain it later. And the other thing I want to point out is that Jesus did, ironically, in turn, cause the rebirth of Israel in 1948 AD, as I will explain later. Okay. Another short response to that final question: why did he not attain in his lifetime? That was the restoration of Israel. So why did he not attain in his lifetime the ingathering of Israel? Okay. My short response to that aspect here, real quick, is the ingathering, as I will show, did begin already due to Jesus, but will be completed at the end days as the prescribed time. That's the important part, as the prescribed time, not the convenient, but because it's written, prescribed time of the exile and final beast kingdom must play out until its final year. Okay? So because God did, it's easy to forget these and not draw them into relevance, but God did warn that there would be this long period of exile. In the prophecy of Daniel, it's relayed how long this will be. That interpretation aligns with history, which shows that those time periods align with the Islamic rule and so forth, right? But even putting the fussy bits aside about, who was the final beast and all that, we know from history and reality that it's been nearly 2,000 years. It's been a long time. We can't pretend that it wasn't, okay, or that it isn't, okay? And if God knows all, then he would know that there would be a vastly long exile in which Israel was scattered, okay? So anyways, The reason I'm saying that is because, like I mentioned here, it'll be completed at the end days. Now, the typical response from Judaism would be, "Oh, well, that's so convenient for you to claim. He didn't do it in his lifetime; he'll do it at the end of days." That's what I'm pointing out, that there was a prescribed time span of the exile and final beast kingdom, which must play out according to the Tanakh until its final year of playing out. Okay, so that's why, right? And the last response to that final question, so why did he not attain in his lifetime the world peace and world rule? Okay, so the world peace and world rule did to a degree begin already due to Jesus, as I'll explain later, but again will be completed at the end days. And again, because the prescribed time of the exile and final beast kingdom must play out until its final year. Okay, and it's important to point out the following. Ezekiel told us that the people of Israel would return to and live in a restored Israel prior to the attack by the armies of Gog Magog, which is prior to the arrival of the end days, in which comes the arrival of the forces of God and Messiah, and then the absolute restoration of Israel and so forth, right? The peace around the world and all that, right? So the point is, Ezekiel told us that there will be a time when Israel is restored, obviously to a degree, but to such a degree that the children of Israel can return there and live there. And they can live there for a period of time until Gog Magog attack them. Right? So let us not forget Ezekiel did reveal that. And that this is proof, therefore, that Israel would be restored prior to the end days arrival itself. And this falls in line with how I am showing that Jesus caused the rebirth of Israel before the end days, which was in 1948, meaning when it was reborn. Therefore, one cannot claim Israel is only restored at the end days, because the Tanakh in Ezekiel clearly shows it will begin restoration before the end days. And what historically began that restoration, which took place in 1948, it was caused by Jesus, as I'll explain later. Okay, so going on. Criteria accepted by Judaism and myself, right? So here there is no argument, so I don't need to waste time getting into these things, but I've broken everything down into a few categories where we agree, where we don't disagree, where one believes this, where the other believes this, right? So the first category is criteria for Messiah, which is accepted by Judaism and myself. So we agree on all these. These are the simple, mundane things, right? The first one is Messiah must be of the tribe of Judah. We all agree on that. Messiah must be the seed of David. We all agree on that. Messiah must be a wise, righteous, Torah-keeping person. We all agree on that. And Messiah would be obeyed and followed by the nations. Okay, we all agree on that. And that's relevant to something I'll point out later, which is, anyways, I'll get into it in its time. So the next category is criteria accepted by myself, i.e., from the true Christian position, but denied by modern Judaism. Okay, the Messiah, and the first one of these is Messiah would be on earth before the fall of Israel. Okay, so again, this criteria that I accept, but that modern Judaism denies. And I say modern like that because I have proof that for a lot of these, or most of these, that historically Judaism did agree with my stance. It's only modern Judaism that it has a changed stance that disagrees with my stance, right? But so the first one is Messiah would be on earth before the fall of Israel. Okay, and I can show this with what is said in Daniel 9 and Malachi 3 and 4. Okay, plus possibly additional by the time I utterly finalize all this presentation project. Okay, so that's the first criteria, right? And I can show that with the evidence that the Tanakh says the Messiah would be on earth before the fall of Israel. Okay, that's very important. If I can prove that, that's going to be epic in proving to Judaism that Jesus is Messiah. So the next criteria, accepted by myself but denied by modern Judaism, is that Messiah would bring or establish a covenant. And we don't even need to fuss the covenant of what and what is the detail. We don't even need to fuss about that. I'll show the verses where this is talked about. This is in Isaiah 42, Isaiah 49, Daniel 9, Malachi 3 and 4. Okay. I will also, the next criteria accepted by myself but denied by modern Judaism is that Messiah would be opposed. Some in Judaism now say that. Historically, they said that, but nonetheless, This is from Daniel 9, Isaiah 53, and Psalms, various Psalms. Next, which I didn't get into as evidence for this here, I could just leave them to the side and worry on the bigger, meatier things. The next criteria is that Messiah would die. But I wanted to mention that Messiah would be opposed because the fact is the Tanakh does say that, and he was opposed. And it's important to talk about this point because many people say, when the Messiah comes, he's going to be accepted. So if you're of that stance, anybody who's opposed, you would not believe is Messiah. But what if the Tanakh allows for Messiah to be opposed? If it does allow for Messiah to be opposed, then you'd be of the wrong position, right? So you don't want to be caught out, right? So anyways, that's why I thought it was important enough to mention, even though it's still very minor. The next criteria, accepted by myself but denied by modern Judaism, is that Messiah would die, according to Tanakh. This is from Daniel 9, Isaiah 53, and again from various Psalms. The last of the criteria accepted by myself but denied by modern Judaism is that Messiah would be a light to the nations. Okay, so modern Judaism says that these chapters and verses are about Israel being a light to the nations, not the Messiah. But anyways, that's what my project here is for, is to prove. Anyways, this is from Isaiah 42, for example. And I could add more, source quotations, to that list. That's probably not comprehensive and final. But anyways, so the next criteria, the next category is not according to Tanakh, not criteria of Messiah specifically, but believed by Judaism as criteria of Messiah. So Tanakh doesn't actually say these things specifically. However, Judaism nonetheless believes them to be criteria of Messiah. Okay. And ironically, all of these were still anyways achieved because of Jesus, right? As I'll explain with the evidence, right? So the following two are not criteria which the Tanakh gives about Messiah specifically, but they are nonetheless believed by Judaism as criteria of Messiah. And the first one is the rebirth of Israel. Okay, so Judaism will say, oh, that happens along with Messiah, the restoration of Israel and the ingathering and all that, right? So the rebirth of Israel. So in short response, no verse in Tanakh mentions that. Where is it? Yeah. So the Tanakh does not mention anywhere that the Messiah, specifically the Messiah, will cause the rebirth of Israel. Okay, it's something that Judaism just assumes or takes for granted or just accepts. That's what they go by and teach and talk about. But there is no Tanakh verse that specifically details Messiah causing the rebirth of Israel. Just important to clarify. And the second criteria, which the Tanakh does not speak of Messiah specifically, but nonetheless Judaism believes as criteria of Messiah, is the ingathering of the children of Israel. Okay, and in similar fashion, no verse in the Tanakh specifically mentions the Messiah as being the one gathering. Okay, the verses specifically say that God will gather. Okay, so these categories are important, right? Now, the last category is just a singular one, singular criteria, right? But this final category is criteria believed by Judaism, but not attained by Jesus until the end days come. Okay? This is the worldwide peace. This obviously wasn't attained by Jesus. It won't be attained. It hasn't been attained now, and it won't be attained until the end days. And this is one of the reasons Judaism says that Jesus couldn't be Messiah, because he didn't cause in his time the rebirth of Israel, the ingathering, the world peace, and world rule. Okay, they say that all comes exclusively at the end days, and that there is no early arrival of Messiah. That's the whole stance. Sorry. That's the whole stance of Judaism. But anyways, and just mentioning here for reference sake, the two Jeremiah branch verses and the shoot verse from Isaiah 11 are the verses which mention a Messiah-like figure along with world peace at the same time. Okay, so they're all localized to the uses of those specific terms. The two Jeremiah branch verses and the shoot verse. Anyways, going on. So therefore, the only thing remaining is world peace, but this is only to be had when the judgment has occurred and all are judged, with the wicked removed and the good remaining to inherit the new earth. If the Messiah, according to Judaism, is to arrive at this end time, and likewise with my own beliefs, because I believe the same, then the only real question is, what proof is there that Tanakh said that Messiah would arrive in initial time before the end time's arrival? And this evidence can be found in Daniel, for example. And that this initial appearance would occur with purpose before the fall of Israel specifically. Okay, that's the timing, right? And evidence for this can be found in Daniel, Isaiah, and Malachi. Going on, the purpose would be to teach and warn Israel before the fall and scattering in near 2,000-year long exile, and also to teach the Gentiles, who were at the time the whole world was pagan, so that when the end times do come, that the Gentiles will have been prepared, or better prepared, as well as the children of Israel. So that would be the purpose of this early arrival, right? Before the fall of Israel would be to do that, right? And the proof for all this is in the words of the prophets, as I aim to prove with this presentation of evidence and analysis. And going on, the Tanakh states that Messiah would appear and die before the fall of Israel, which logically precedes the restoration of Israel at the end of days. And since we are told that Messiah is present at the end days when Israel is fully gathered, we know therefore that Tanakh has revealed that he comes twice, with the first arrival at a time when Israel was about to be scattered, and the second arrival at a time when Israel is about to be gathered. So two complete opposites. As scattering is opposite of gathering, this shows and proves that the two events are not one the same event, and that they are separated by a span of time of exile, and therefore that Messiah must be here twice if he is to be present for both. Judaism accepts that the exile has been near 2,000 years since the fall of Israel, so nobody could argue that the two appearances of Messiah and that the scattering and gathering would occur within a single lifetime. This logic alone strongly suggests that the Messiah was foretold to come twice, separated by what would be a long span of time. I can prove that Tanakh does say Messiah would appear and die before the fall by comparing statements which the various prophets made, which all accord to one another using the same terms, proving that the Messiah is the one who appears before the fall of Israel, and who brings a covenant, and who is opposed and dies, and who is to be a light unto the Gentiles. And a quick summary conclusion, just up front, is the historical proof a type of conclusion, not overall conclusion, but for lack of a better term, here's a little summary conclusion up front. The historical proof that validates that Jesus must have been the Messiah. So this is historical proof, okay? Looking back at history at things that actually happened. So the fact that the world was depaganized with at least 80% of all paganism being eradicated, which literally only occurred because Jesus existed, taught what he did to the true original Christians, and they went around the known world at the time and eradicated the paganism. Okay, when the Catholics came around, they used force, which Jesus spoke out against. He said, if you live by the sword, you die by the sword, as a direct lesson to this very type of thing. But nonetheless, right, we cannot deny, it's an undeniable fact that the reason that the world has had about 80% or more of the paganism removed from it is because Jesus existed. He was the starting domino who put that trail of dominoes in effect. He pushed off the first domino, started the effect, commanded his followers to spread that effect by taking, this knowledge around the world, by taking the light around the world. And it's undeniable that the paganism was removed because of that. Okay? Yes, Islam did remove some of the paganism in the lands that it conquered as well, but 80% of the world is not pagan anymore. Over 80% is not pagan anymore. And this is because of the efforts of Christianity, which wouldn't have existed if it wasn't for Jesus, right? So this is historical proof that validates each of these in part, that validate that Jesus must have been the Messiah, right? So the depaganization of the world. Next is the Christian empire, and this would be controversial for Judaism, but nonetheless, there has been oppression. Everybody knows there has been oppression from Christians to the Jewish people, right? And that's very wrong, because the New Testament tells us that we should look honorably on the Jews, and they even get salvation first. and that all Israel will be saved, and it teaches the importance of all of our relationship. So it's shameful that any Christians historically did oppress the Jewish people, but nonetheless, the Christian empire that ended up conquering most of the known world. That's another historical proof, because the Messiah is supposed to have a global reaching kingdom and empire and influence. And we do see this literally and tangibly and historically with Jesus. Next, the whole world has heard of the God of Israel now, and the Bible is available around the world, again, exclusively due to the Christian influence, which only occurred because Jesus. Okay, so all of these things, as I go through this little list here, are things that the Messiah is supposed to accomplish. We can clearly see that, yeah, Jesus didn't accomplish these things in his lifetime, but he started that domino effect purposely and commanded it to be done. Okay, it didn't just happen by coincidence. He commanded it to be done. Go out to all men everywhere and teach all men everywhere to reform. That was the command to the disciples and apostles when he instructed them to go out to the world and to all the pagans and to make them come to the true God, right? So, anyways, going on, Christianity spread across the known world, and currently 33% of Earth's population is Christian. That's a massive number, bigger than any other world religion. And with 80% of nations being either under a Christian empire or a Christian based law or government system. That's a pretty impressive statistic, because everybody takes that for granted in our modern days. But these governments and law systems and prisons and judicial systems and police, it's just everything together, right? A lot of this that we see around the world, almost all of it, about 80% of it, according to the AI, 80% of it is because of Christianity. Okay, and before this and without this, it was tribe versus tribe, tribe conquering tribe, tribe enslaving tribe, over and over for tens of thousands of years on this planet, right? But now we have proper government systems, proper judicial systems, prison systems, police systems, all sorts of things, right? That we never had before. And we only have these things because of the Christian influence. And if Jesus had never existed, and if Christianity hadn't spread, and if the knowledge of God, of Israel, hadn't spread, and all of this, and the imperative to be a good person and to not do us, if all that had not spread, we would still be in the dark ages of the world, the whole planet full of pagans. I can promise and guarantee you that, because Judaism is never missionized. They've never, taught Gentiles. They're proud not to. To this day, they're proud not to teach it, and they say so. So, if it wasn't for Jesus and Christianity, we would only have the few in Judaism. And if it wasn't for Christianity, as I'll show later, Judaism, the people of Israel, the land of Israel, may not even exist anymore today, right? That's the other shocking thing, right? Now, the next one in the short list, the final one, is that Jesus is the number one most influential and popular person to have ever existed in all history. Undeniable fact. With the largest religion on earth. Okay, and he did this without being a wealthy, powerful, famous person. He wasn't a ruler. He wasn't all those titles. He was a nobody, essentially a peace-loving, peace-teaching hippie, okay, who allegedly did some miraculous healings, right? But despite all of that meagerness, he's the most influential and popular person to have ever existed, with 1/3 of the world's population following him, the largest religion on earth. And finally, the Christian empire defeating the enemy of Israel in World War II, rebirthing the nation of Israel as a nation, and causing the ingathering to begin. These are other undeniable historical things that have taken place to validate that Jesus must have been the Messiah. Now, going on, what cannot be denied is that Israel right now would not exist if Jesus had not existed, because you wouldn't have had Christianity, you wouldn't have had the Christian imperative to do all of this and to help protect their fellow brethren of God, and all of you, that wouldn't have happened. We'd all still be pagans. Nobody would care about the children of Israel. And if Germany had risen up and done that, then the worst would have occurred if the Christians weren't there essentially to save them, right? So what cannot be denied is that Israel right now, as a nation, would not exist if Jesus had not existed. You might not want to swallow that pill, but it's absolutely true. Next, what cannot be denied is that the majority of people of Israel right now would likely not even be in Israel for the same reason if Jesus had not existed. And also, what cannot be denied is that the majority of Earth would still be pagan civilizations if Jesus had not existed. And finally, what cannot be denied is that the knowledge of God and His Word around the world would not exist if Jesus had not existed. These are things everybody takes for granted, but are absolutely stellar truths we all take for granted. But if we didn't have Jesus, then we wouldn't have had any of these things, and we would all be in the dark ages. Nobody would have heard of the God of Israel. Nobody would have heard his word. We'd all still be pagan. Okay. Israel as a nation wouldn't even exist. Okay. The people wouldn't even be there. Very few may have been in the land originally, right? Who stayed there since the fall, right? Is what I meant to say, right? But all the people who came there because of 1948, they wouldn't be there. Okay, there would be no nation to return to. It'd still be under Islamic rule. Okay, and if Germany's still historically risen up without Jesus existing, if that were to occur, then Judaism and the people of Israel would have been likely eradicated or greatly eradicated because of what Germany was doing at the time. The only reason we have anything that we do right now is because of Jesus, and we all have to accept that reality. Next, what cannot be denied is that all these things are things which Messiah would cause, even according to Judaism. The rebirth of Israel, the ingathering, the end of paganization, the knowledge of God throughout the world, and so forth, right? These are all things which even Judaism says Messiah would cause. Now, the Tanakh does not state that the Gentiles will take this mission up by themselves, or that this great mission will come from some messianic reject or other individual. It says such things come about from the Messiah. Okay, and what can we see observably having happened in history is that Jesus, who was Messiah, as I argue, gave this imperative, okay, and gave it to the people to spread this light across the world, right? So the Tanakh doesn't state that the Gentiles will take this mission up by themselves. It says that the Messiah will this mission will come from the Messiah, okay? Judaism would argue that Messiah isn't the one who's supposed to take uh, the light to the Gentiles. They say it's Israel who's supposed to do that, but that's a whole other argument for another time. Anyways, whilst we don't have world peace at the moment, with the eradication of paganism around the world, the countless terrible beliefs and practices of daily life of pagans have ended, and law systems based on the Bible are implemented in around 80% of all world nations, as noted above, with courts, prisons, and police systems in all nations. Whilst it is still far from peace on earth or perfection now, it is still arguably far better off than it was. Because Judaism and myself accept that Messiah will arrive at the end days judgment period to usher in the world peace and global rule, what therefore matters is proving to Judaism that Messiah would arrive and also die before the fall of Israel, as explained below with and by all the various evidence. Now, I can tell you now that there is no way on earth that I'm going to be able to read the rest of this in the time that I have. I will try, but I don't think so. But first, in Malachi 3 and Malachi 4, the key, and I grouped the verses here by key terms. So these verses use the following key terms: covenant and root or branch. It's also talking about the Messiah, but it doesn't say that specifically by word. It doesn't say Messiah, but it's speaking about the Messiah. But it does verbatim mention covenant and verbatim mention root or branch. It's also speaking about the Messiah dying, although it doesn't say that verbatim. And it's also speaking about just before the fall of Israel, even though it doesn't verbatim say that. So in Malachi 3:1, it says, Lo, I am sending my messenger, and he has prepared a way before me, and suddenly come into his temple does the Lord, whom ye are seeking, even the messenger of the covenant, whom ye are desiring. Lo, he is coming, said the God of hosts, and who is bearing the day of his coming, and who is standing in his appearing? For he is as fire of a refiner, and as soap of a fuller. Malachi 4:1. For lo, the day has come, burning as a furnace, and all the proud and every wicked doer have been stubble, and burnt them as the day that came, said God of hosts, that there is not left of them root or branch. Lo, I am sending, and later, lo, I am sending to you Elijah the prophet before the coming of the day of God, the great and the fearful, and he has turned back the hearts of fathers to sons, and the heart of sons to their fathers, before I come and have utterly smitten the land. So that's what the verses say. So as I mentioned, they mentioned the term covenant and root or branch. Now, these verses, as I would argue, I don't have time to fully explain everything here today. I'll try to race through the material. These verses are talking about how the Messiah would arrive before the fall of Israel, right? I corroborate this with the later scripture down the page, right? But I have to introduce everything brick by brick, right? This is corroborated later. Okay. Where is it? So before I have come and utterly smitten the land, right? So next, Isaiah 42 in this 42 verse 1 in this one uses the term verbatim my servant, verbatim my chosen one, verbatim covenant, verbatim becomes weak and well, pretty much verbatim becomes weak and oppressed, verbatim light to the nations, verbatim open eyes. I don't have time to get into the open eyes thing, but even still, even without that, my servant, my chosen one, covenant becomes weak or oppressed and light to the nations. Remember Malachi 3 1 and 4 1, we see covenant and root or branch, right? And it's talking about the Messiah, as I argue, right? But all the interconnectivity between these various different chapters of the prophets will highlight the Messiah figure because all these terms are used to about one figure. Anyways, um, so in Isaiah 42 1, it says, Lo, my servant, I take hold on him, my chosen one, my soul is accepted. I put my spirit upon him. Judgment to nations he bringeth forth. He does not cry, nor lift up, nor cause his voice to be heard in the street. A bruised reed he breaketh not, a dim flax he quencheth not. To truth he bringeth forth judgment. He does not become weak. And the Hebrew is for dim or fail, or oppressed, till he setteth judgment in the earth, and for his law isles wait with hope. And then later it says, I, God, did call thee in righteousness, and I lay hold on thy hand and keep thee, and I give thee for a covenant of a people and a light of nations, to open the eyes of the blind, to bring forth from prison the bound one, from the house of restraint those sitting in darkness. So that's what that verse selection says there. Right. So again, it talks about my servant, my chosen one, which I argue is the Messiah figure, but it mentions also verbatim covenant becomes weak or oppressed. So it says here that this figure will become dim or fail, i.e., weak, uh, that he will not become weak or oppressed until he setteth judgment in the earth. So it is saying that he will become weak and oppressed, okay, but not until he has setteth judgment in the earth. It also mentions how his law, and for his law, isles, i.e., the Gentiles, the nations, will wait with hope because Israel wasn't the isles. Islands are Gentile nations, right? So the connection from Isaiah 42 to Malachi is that both of these figures are mentioned as bringing a covenant or accompanying the bringing of a covenant. Okay, but going on the next one, Isaiah 49:5. In this selection, it mentions servant, covenant, and light to nations. So Isaiah 49 connects over to Isaiah 42 because both of these mention servant, covenant, and light to nations. So in Isaiah 49:5, it says, And now said God, who is forming me from the belly for a servant to him, to bring back Jacob unto him, though Israel is not gathered, yet I am honored in the eyes of God, and my God has been my strength. And he saith, It has been a light thing that thou art to me for a servant to raise up the tribes of Jacob and the preserved of Israel to bring back. And I have given thee for a light of nations to be my salvation unto the end of the earth. Thus said God, In a time of good pleasure I answered thee, and in a day of salvation I helped thee, and I keep thee and give thee for a covenant of the people to establish the earth, to cause to inherit desolate inheritances, to say to the bound, Go out, to those in darkness, be uncovered. On the ways they feed, and in all high places is their pasture. Okay, so going on, this next one, which is Isaiah 53, verse 2 and verse 7. These verses mention servant again. It talks about this figure dying, which, as I'll argue, is about the Messiah, i.e., that the Messiah is dying, not about Israel. I can argue that if successfully, but I don't have time for that here today. But focusing on the important thing for time's sake, these verses mention servant, root, and they talk about this figure dying, the Messiah dying. And just pointing out for the audience and for myself, reference, the term for tender plant here is yoneq, Yoneq, different from the shoot or sema term for branch, which is found in Jeremiah and Isaiah 4, right? So it's different. In Isaiah 53, verse 2, it says, Yea, he cometh up as a tender plant before him, and as a root out of a dry land. He has no form nor honor when we observe him, nor appearance when we desire him. Then in verse 7, it has been exacted, and he has answered, and he openeth not his mouth. As a lamb to the slaughter he is brought, and as a sheep before its shearers is dumb, and he openeth not his mouth. By restraint and by judgment he has been taken, and of his generation who does meditate that he has been cut off from the land of the living. By the transgression of my people he is plagued, and it appointeth with the wicked his grave, and with the rich are his high places, because he has done no violence, nor is deceit in his mouth. And later, of the labor of his soul he seeth, he is satisfied. Through his knowledge give righteousness does the righteous one, my servant, to many, and their iniquities he does bear. So this talks about this servant figure being cut off. Key, because that links over to Daniel 9. Okay, so like I was saying, in this selection here, it talks about the servant, also called the root, and it talks about this figure dying, and as I argue, this is the Messiah dying. Okay, so if we then go on to the next one, do I need to read this one? I should have Daniel 9 here somewhere as well. Oh, it's down. No. I'm supposed to have Daniel 9 here, and I don't have Daniel 9. Oh, no, it's up here. Why didn't... Oh, I skipped past it. Okay, I read Malachi first, and it was supposed to be Daniel. Anyways, okay, so that probably ruined the build up there. But anyways, so Daniel 9:24, this selection of verses mentions verbatim mentions Messiah, covenant, and it's talking about Messiah dying, not verbatim, and this is occurring before the fall of Israel. Again, not verbatim, but this is what it's talking about. So in Daniel 9:24, 70 weeks are determined for thy people and for thy holy city to shut up the transgression and to seal up sins and to cover iniquity and to bring in righteousness age during and to seal up vision and prophet and to anoint the Holy of Holies. And thou dost know and dost consider wisely from the going forth of the word to restore and to build Jerusalem till Messiah, the leader, is 7 weeks. That's Mashiach Nagid. Is 7 weeks and 60 and 2 weeks. The broad place has been built again in the rampart, even in the distress of the times. And after the 60 and 2 weeks, cut off is Messiah, and the city and the holy place are not his. The leader who has come does destroy the people, and its end is with a flood. Until the end is war, determined are desolations, and he has strengthened a covenant with many. So again, like I said, this verbatim mentions Messiah. I know Judaism's argument here and how they say it's not Jesus. That's due to their calendar, which I'll get into in a moment. This again would be another subtopic I could bring further evidence to in greater detail another time. Many things tied into here, but for the focus of this, for right now, this mentions Messiah verbatim, covenant verbatim, and about Messiah dying and before the fall. So let's go and compare these key terms in these key concepts between these chapters that I've read. So in Daniel 9:24, we have Messiah and covenant, and it's talking about Messiah dying before the fall of Israel. Okay, if we go to Malachi 3 and 4, it's talking about who is the Messiah. It mentions covenant as well, okay, and how the root and branch will be cut off, which is Messiah dying, because Messiah is the root and the branch. And this is happening before the fall, when God comes to utterly smite the land. So I could argue, don't have time today to argue in full, but I could argue how Malachi there is actually speaking about the same thing, the same event. Messiah would come along with a covenant or bring a covenant himself. Messiah would die before the fall of Israel. They're both talking about the same one thing. Okay? In Isaiah 42, it's talking about my servant, which, like I argue, is the Messiah. Okay? It mentions the same term again, covenant. Okay? And it also mentions becomes weak and oppressed. Okay? Now, it doesn't say cut off, doesn't say die, but still along the same lines, using those other same terms. It also has added a new term into the mix, which is being a light to the nations. That links it over to Isaiah 49, where it also says that this servant figure, who again comes along with a covenant, is a light to nations. So Isaiah 49 links with Isaiah 42. So Isaiah 42 and Isaiah 49 are clearly talking about the same one figure. The servant who brings a covenant, who becomes weakened, and is a light to the nations. Okay? This matches with Daniel 9 and Malachi 3 and 4, where the Messiah type figure comes with a covenant and then dies before the fall of Israel. Okay, so all of that goes in hand. And next in Isaiah 53, it's again the same figure, my servant, the root, and how the Messiah will die. And it doesn't mention before the fall of Israel. It doesn't mention, I don't think, specifically light to the nations here. But what we can see is that clearly all these different chapters correlate. Okay? They use the same terms. They're talking about the same thing. Okay? They all correlate together. They all tie together. And what this overall shows you is that this figure, okay, the my servant, this root, this branch, the chosen one, okay, will be here and die before the fall of Israel. That is what it's showing you conclusively, right? I don't have time to further elaborate and so forth, right? But that's the basis of this, right? The following root and branch verses, where it mentions the terms root and branch, show it being cut off before the fall of Israel. So in Isaiah 9:12, it says, "A ram from before and Philistia from behind, and they devour Israel with the whole mouth. With all this, not turned back has his anger, and still his hand is stretched out, and the people has not turned back unto him who is smiting it." Again, the same term that Malachi used. "And the God of hosts they have not sought, and God cutteth off from Israel head and tail, branch and reed the same day. Elder and accepted of face, he is the head, prophet, teacher of falsehood, he is the tail." Right? In the same fashion, it's talking about a day of smiting and how the branch will be cut off. Right? A day of smiting of Israel with the branch of Israel being cut off. Same thing Malachi says in 4 verse 1. "For lo, the day has come, burning as a furnace, and all the proud and every wicked doer have been stubble, and burnt them as the day that came, said God of hosts, that there is not left to them root or branch." And this is where it just said in Malachi 3, he's going to come and utterly smite the land. This is the same thing that's being spoken about. Okay, and again, this is focusing on the term branch that is used. We know that branch is a term about the Messiah. Even Judaism accepts this. This is the term that's used in Jeremiah, and they tout the Jeremiah verses that use the term branch as verses about the Messiah. Okay, so going on. So what this is showing is that the Messiah figure is definitely tied to, okay, these warnings that the Messiah will be cut off that we see in Malachi and Daniel. That's what Isaiah is revealing there in chapter 9. But going on, I mentioned, if we are told in Isaiah and Malachi that the root dies before the fall of Israel, then later told the root is there for the ingathering of Israel, then this proves the root has returned. You cannot ingather at the fall of Israel. Just an important observation point. The following branch and one root verses must be at the end of days and not afore the fall of Israel. So this Isaiah 11:1 talks about branch from roots. "And a rod has come out from the stock of Jesse, and a branch from his roots is fruitful. Resting on him as the Spirit of God, the Spirit of wisdom and understanding, the Spirit of counsel and might, the Spirit of knowledge and fear of God, to refresh him in the fear of God. And by the sight of his eyes he judgeth not, nor by the hearing of his ears decideth. And he has judged in righteousness the poor, and decided in uprightness for the humble of earth, and has smitten earth with the rod of his mouth, and with the breath of his lips he putteth the wicked to death. And righteousness has been the girdle of his loins, and faithfulness the girdle of his reins." Okay, so it doesn't say anything really important about Messiah in terms of criteria. Nothing, no major criteria, but it does call him the branch from the roots, right? So branch from roots. That's Isaiah 11:1, a verse that Judaism touts as being about Messiah, if I'm not mistaken. But I have the list from Judaism at the bottom here. Anyways, the next verse from Isaiah 11:9 mentions the term root and ensign, and ensign is another sub discussion I could get into, which would provide some additional evidence, but that's for another time. It's not necessary to this presentation here. But Isaiah 11:9, "Evil they do not, nor destroy in all my holy mountain, for full has been the earth with the knowledge of God, as the waters are covering the sea. And there has been in that day a root of Jesse that is standing for an ensign of peoples. Unto him do nations seek, and his rest has been honor." Okay, so even though Jesus began the process of depaganizing the earth, establishing, like a biblical government over almost all the earth, a biblical form empire over most of the earth, even though Jesus caused the rebirth of Israel and the ingathering of the people of Israel to start, even though all of that was accomplished, the fullness of all of this doesn't occur until the end days judgment and the forces of God and Messiah arrive here on this earth once and for all. Of course, I agree with that. Judaism agrees with that. Okay. But what's important is that in Jeremiah and in these verses, where it's specifying this peace on earth and the world rule being associated with Messiah, the different terms for the Messiah figure are used. It's branch and roots, whereas in all the other occurrences, we see other terms. We only see root used once. This links that initial Messiah figure with the latter Messiah figure because of this root. Okay, a branch from his roots is fruitful. Okay, so the branch is the figure, such as from Jeremiah that Judaism claims as Messiah. This branch comes from the root. Okay, two different appearances. But anyways, shoot and branch, the term sema, can be found in Jeremiah 23. Although the days are coming in affirmation of God, and I've raised to David a righteous shoot, branch, and a king has reigned and acted wisely and done judgment and righteousness in the earth. In his days is Judah saved, and Israel dwelleth confidently. In this his name that God proclaimeth our righteousness. That obviously did not occur in Jesus' lifetime and will not occur until the end of days. This is my point. The shoot, the branch verses are things that occur with the final coming of Messiah at the end of days. They will not occur before, whereas the other things do occur before. In Jeremiah 33:15, in those days and at that time I caused to shoot up to David a shoot branch of righteousness, and he has done judgment and righteousness in the earth. In those days is Judah saved, and Jerusalem does dwell confidently, and this is he whom God proclaimeth to her our righteousness. Going on, historical opinions of Judaism on key verses. Do I really have time to get into this stuff? I'm going to be really late. Anyways, historical interpretive. I asked the AI to get a quick answer here to save me having to do all the hard work digging this up myself. But historical and interpretive perspectives on Isaiah 42 and other chapters. I asked it, despite the fact modern Judaism denies these verses are about Messiah, did historically Judaism ever hold these as being about Messiah? Well, what Jewish sources are there? Right, so here we go. To determine which historical sources consider Isaiah 42 to be about the Messiah, one must examine the intersection of ancient Jewish commentary, early and Christian interpretation, and the linguistic structure of the text itself. The identification of the servant in Isaiah 42 as an individual Messiah is supported by several distinct historical and theological traditions. First, the linguistic evidence within the Hebrew Masoretic text utilizes singular pronouns and verbs such as Avdi, my servant, and Bekiri, my chosen one, which distinguishes the figure from the collective nation of Israel, often addressed in plural forms elsewhere in the book. Second, various Jewish sources historically apply these passages to the messianic figure. The Talmud Bavli and Midrash Rabbah contain traditions that interpret the suffering and mission of the servant in the servant songs, which include Isaiah 42, as referring to the Messiah. Furthermore, medieval Jewish commentator Rashi explicitly interpreted Isaiah 42:1 as a prophecy concerning the Messiah, who would be endowed with the Spirit of God to bring justice to the world. Okay, and going on, I asked it also about Isaiah 49 and other chapters, and it says historical and mystical Jewish sources, including certain Midrashic traditions and later commentaries, have identified the servant as King Messiah, who is viewed as the ultimate representative of Israel and the one who will facilitate the final redemption and the restoration of the desolate heritages. For instance, the Pesikta Rabbati contains traditions that associate the imagery of the hidden light and the servant who will shame the nations with the coming of the Messiah. So, according to history, Judaism did believe these Isaiah chapters that are used as evidence are about Messiah. So, modern Judaism says, oh, no, you're wrong, that I'm wrong, because those chapters aren't about Messiah. The servant figure is not Messiah, it's Israel. Okay? But historically, Judaism did believe they were about Messiah. And as I could prove if I have more time at another day, with further elaboration, I could show and elaborate on the connectivity in here and how these things logically in steps prove that this figure must be the Messiah, the servant figure in these chapters in particular, the one who brings the light to the nations and so forth, right? But anyway, so it's not just my opinion, it's historical Judaism also is of the same opinion that these chapters are about Messiah. So like I point out, if Judaism did historically hold that Isaiah 42 and Isaiah 49 and even Isaiah 53 are about the Messiah, then that in hand, as I showed just before this, ties those chapters, as I showed, to Daniel 9 and Malachi 3 and 4, which talk about what is the Messiah figure coming and dying before the fall of Israel. That is key and that is vital. Okay, And in Daniel 9, similarly, I asked the AI to find what historical Jewish sources consider Daniel 9 as being about the Messiah. And it says the Zohar, this foundational work of Jewish mysticism, explicitly interprets the cutting off of the Anointed One in Daniel 9 as the death of the Messiah, son of Joseph, a figure in Jewish eschatology who is traditionally expected to suffer and die before the arrival of the Messiah, son of David. And I've always argued before that in light of that Jewish perspective of Ben Yosef and Ben David, Jesus Christ of Nazareth, the first coming would have been as Ben Yosef figure, and the final coming at the end of days with the immortal life and all that would be the Ben David figure, right? Another source is Isaac Barbanel in his work Mayane HaYeshua, Springs of Salvation. The 15th century scholar Isaac Barbanel explicitly attributed the passage to the Messiah, son of David. However, he diverged from the Christian interpretation of cutting off his death. Instead, he interpreted it as a postponement or delay in the revelation of the Messiah's glory due to the sins of Israel, viewing the event as a future occurrence relative to his own time. And then Rashi, medieval commentator Rashi offered a different historical identification, suggesting the passage referred to King Agrippa, the final king of Judea, before the destruction of the Second Temple. While Rashi did not identify him as the ultimate Messiah, he acknowledged that the figure described in the prophecy had to appear on the historical scene prior to the destruction of the Second Temple in 70 A.D. So that's important evidence as well, because this comes down to one of the primary things it comes down to is the timing. The prophecy in Daniel 9, which I and most Christians would argue from 457 BC with the decree, which historically was verified coming from Artaxerxes to rebuild Jerusalem, both street and wall, 483 years later is the year Jesus would have died as Messiah in 27 AD. Okay? Judaism's argument is no, your calendars are wrong. Our calendar is right. The temple didn't fall in 587. The first temple didn't fall in 587. It fell in like 422 BC. Everything you guys have is off by 100 and something years. So the text couldn't be talking about Jesus because it's off by 100 and something years. This is their argument, but I can prove that their argument there is invalid and why it's invalid. Okay? So that's the only thing that Judaism has to hinge on, because Daniel 9 says Messiah and will be cut off. And it's easy to explain with fair argument that being cut off there, using that Hebrew term, the way it's used elsewhere in the Bible to talk about actual cutting off, death, and so forth, is strong evidence that the figure is dying and not being taken out of office. Okay? And the term Messiah, you can't get any more Messiah of a term than that. Okay? It's primarily hinges for Judaism. Their excuse is that our calendars are off by 100 something years. But their argument is invalid, as I'll get to in its time later. Next, this is additional evidence from Malachi. I don't have this properly assorted here. But this section here, so in Micah 6:13, it says, "And I also have begun to smite thee," talking to Israel, "to make desolate because of thy sins." This is to identify that God does use that same terminology that Malachi used, "before I come and utterly smite the land." He definitely does say that about Israel, "smite thee to make desolate," which is what Malachi would have been speaking about if the smiting of Israel that Malachi was speaking about was the fall of Israel, which was historically followed by desolation. Okay? Now in Zechariah, this links together. The wounded figure, which Christianity says is Messiah, coincides with the refining of the people, which agrees with what Malachi said would occur, like how it would be a soap of a fuller and it would be like a furnace, day of a furnace. Okay, and Zechariah says 2/3 were cut off, and this can be fairly shown to be the fall of Israel in 70 AD. So in Zechariah 13:1, "In that day there is a fountain open to the house of David and to the inhabitants of Jerusalem for sin and for impurity." And then in verse 6, "And one has said to him, What are these wounds in thy hands? And he has said, Because I was smitten at home by my lovers. Sword, awake against my shepherd, and against the hero, my fellow, an affirmation of God of hosts. Smite the shepherd, and scattered is the flock. And I have put back my hand on the little ones. And it has come to pass in all the land an affirmation of God. 2 parts in it are cut off, they expire, and the third is left in it. And I have brought the third into fire, and refined them like a refining of silver, and have tried them like a trying of gold. It does call in my name, and I answer it, and I have said, My people it is, and it saith, God is my God, Hashem is my God." So Zechariah here is interesting because this figure, which I would argue is the Messiah, but this figure here is dying before Israel is smitten. So again, the same pattern that we see in Malachi and in Daniel 9, as I've shown here, right? That this Messiah figure would die before Israel is smitten, because it says, smite the shepherd and scattered is the flock. Okay. And then 2/3 expire and they're being refined. So this directly ties to Malachi. So again, we see more corroborating evidence of that observable pattern of the messianic figure dying before the fall of Israel, that he arrives, but also that he dies before the fall of Israel. This is critical evidence, right? And then here we go. This is getting into the calendar issue that Judaism has. So I have my own argument to say on this, because in one of my published books, I detail the chronology. And I myself, my chronology, going through the Bible, every number that it supplies and so forth, using the arithmetic, using the algebra, it matched exactly what Judaism says, all the way up until sometime around Jacob. It was like, how old was Jacob when he had Joseph? Something like that. I can't remember off the top of my head. It was around that time period that 100 something years go missing. And that, for me, that said it, because it's at that point there in the chronology supplied by the Bible, you have to use algebra instead of arithmetic. Until that point, it's arithmetic. At this point, you had to use algebra. It was difficult, but once I used the algebra, using numbers supplied by verses, it was solvable. I verified it with what historians say. It lines up with what scholars what scholars, um, it agrees with what scholars say and propose as well, right? So it's fitting. It's not 100 and something years off. So I would think that it's because of that problem with the texts. You also have that conflict. There's a conflict in the scripture where it says, I think, like 430 years in one place, and another place says 400. So there's that as well, right? But all these together, you get the 100 and something year difference. That's what I observed. I think it's also an error in the chronology, the accounting for every year from the biblically supplied data, right? Nonetheless, the AI supplied another argument, which I've heard before, explaining how Judaism's calendar is off because they made an error in the Persian history, right, timeline. Anyways, so my point is that Judaism argues that Daniel 9 maths don't point to the years Jesus would have died in, as their calendar differs from what is commonly accepted by historians. So this is what the AI said about the calendar issue. The claim that the 490 years from Daniel 9 should be measured from the fall of the first temple is historically and chronologically inconsistent with the standard academic and archaeological consensus regarding the Persian period, as the interval between the destruction of the first temple, which was 586 BC, and the destruction of the second temple, 70 CE, spans approximately 656 years, which mathematically exceeds the 490 years specified in the text. While the Jewish interpretation serves a theological purpose by aligning the prophecy with the duration of the Second Temple's existence, it requires a non-literal or shortened chronology of the Persian era, often referred to as the Seder Olam Rabbah chronology, which posits that the Persian Empire lasted only 52 years rather than the approximately 200 years established by modern historical records. The chronological discrepancy of the First Temple. To determine the year the First Temple fell according to traditional Jewish chronology, one must examine the internal logic of the Seder Olam Rabbah, a foundational rabbinic text that serves as the basis for the traditional Hebrew calendar. The academic consensus, supported by Babylonian and Persian records, dates the destruction of the First Temple 587 or 586 BC. However, traditional Jewish chronology, as established in the Seder Olam Rabbah, calculates the destruction of the Second Temple to 68 CE, by asserting that the Second Temple stood for 420 years and that there was a 70-year interval between the destruction of the First Temple and the construction of the Second. The tradition arrives at a date of 422 BC or 423 BC in some interpretations for the destruction of the First Temple, which of course is 100 and something years different from what is real. This discrepancy, often referred to as the missing years, arises because the rabbinic calculation of the Persian period, which lasted 270 years according to modern historical records, is compressed to only 34 years in the Seder Olam Rabbah. Various scholars and thinkers have proposed that this was an intentional omission by the sages to align historical timelines with theological milestones, such as the era of Torah or the transition of the Seleucid era, rather than a literal historical record of the Persian king reigns. And finally, I'll end on this note. So again, I didn't have this presentation entirely wrapped up in terms of the narration in between everything, or the elaboration on everything, which is part of the narration that is to come. But I want to read what I have so far because it's taken a lot of work over 2 weeks. Last thing to read. Final additional. These are just a compilation of the claims that Judaism makes, which are in fact not correct. And I'm not trying to demonize them, but they are verifiably not correct. But they are claims that you will hear them say. And I've got one of their sources here as well. right? So Judaism claims some things which are not actually correct and uses these falsehoods to disqualify Jesus as the Messiah, whether intentionally, unintentionally, whatever. That's the end effect. Okay. First, there are no verses in the Tanakh that state that the Messiah will gather Israel or build the temple, contrary to the claims of Judaism against Jesus. They claim Jesus failed to be Messiah because he didn't build the temple and gather Israel. However, the Tanakh does not state anywhere that the Messiah will gather Israel or that he will build the temple. It specifies a figure who is historically Zerubbabel would build the temple, and he did. Okay, so that's just the first thing. They claim something, but it's not actually the fact. Uh, the next one is God is the one who gathers Israel in all the Tanakh verses. Oh, and I said this. And Zerubbabel is the branch in Zechariah who will build the second temple, which is accepted by most scholars. Next, Tanakh does state in Isaiah 35 that miracles of healing would occur in the Messianic era, hence when the Messiah come. Judaism also holds, even modern Judaism holds Isaiah 35 as messianic. Yet, Judaism claims that Messiah was not meant to do miracles, and that by Jesus doing miracles to win favor was a sign of him being a false prophet. This is in defiance of the fact that Tanakh states in Isaiah 35 that miracles of healing would occur in this messianic era when Messiah is here. Healing miracles would occur. Judaism, furthermore, holds this chapter to be messianic. But despite that, my point is, they claim that Jesus was a fraud because he did miracles. That doesn't make sense. Next, Judaism also has an altered timeline which they use to disqualify Jesus when they interpret Daniel 9. Yet scholars in history show their timeline is wrong, and the actual timeline in history fits with what Daniel said, and this directly points to Jesus, dying in 27 AD before the fall of Israel in 70 AD. Next, Judaism also claims Messiah will not die and that Jesus is disqualified because he died. Yet there is no verse in Tanakh which states Messiah will not die. And in fact, there are verses which arguably reveal that Messiah will die. For example, the famous list of verses about Messiah, and the next point, for example, the famous list of verses about Messiah criteria, which are often given by Judaism and Jewish sources, are in fact very misleading in terms of being insincere. In virtually every last case, the verses that are always listed are not about Messiah at all when you read them. And Judaism is just attributing them to the Messiah. Yet ironically, the few verses which do in fact speak of Messiah verbatim, they deny are about Messiah. So it seems very flip-floppy. You got a list of verses they always tout as being about Messiah. They count them as criteria for Messiah that Jesus didn't fulfill. But none of those verses are about Messiah. Red flag. Next red flag is the few verses that Tanakh does say Messiah verbatim, they go on to deny is about Messiah. It's just some anointed God. Second major red flag. It's very flip-floppy. It's like the opposite of what seems common sense there, or what it should be. You know what I mean? And here's, ending on this, this is a reference from Jew FAQ, which is a website, very famous. On their page, what will the Messiah do? Okay, what will the Mashiach do? It says the Mashiach will bring about the political and spiritual redemption of the Jewish people by bringing us back to Israel and restoring Jerusalem. And they quote Isaiah 11, Jeremiah 23, Jeremiah 30, Hosea 3. He will establish a government in Israel, they say, that will be the center of all world government, both for Jews and Gentiles. They say this reference in Isaiah 2, Isaiah 11, Isaiah 42. It says he will rebuild the temple and reestablish its worship. They say this is from Jeremiah 33. And then they say he will restore the religious court system of Israel and establish Jewish law as the law of the land. They say this is from Jeremiah 33. Now, while I don't disagree with any of these points, ironically, yeah, Messiah is going to do these things. What I wanted to point out here is that these verses that they mention don't even specify Messiah. None of them do. I could be wrong, maybe one out of all of them, but none of them actually mention the Messiah. But they attribute them to being about Messiah. And they turn around and claim that these are the things that Tanakh claims are criteria of Messiah. But the verses don't even speak of Messiah. How could they act as criteria? Right? And then they provide the following list of passages referring to Mashiach in Tanakh. Right? It says the following passages in the Jewish scriptures are the ones that Jews consider to be messianic in nature or relating to the end of days. These are the ones that we rely upon in developing our messianic concept. And these are the ones they try to use against Jesus as Messiah. All of these, I might be wrong, I missed one. All of these do not even mention Messiah. I went through them all. Like I said, I'll give myself benefit of doubt. Maybe I missed one, but all of them don't mention Messiah. So they list off all of these. You look at it, think, wow, it's a big list. And you take the time to go read through it all. Not one mention of Messiah, right? So it's Isaiah 2, Isaiah 11, Isaiah 42, which I do say is about it, Isaiah 59, Jeremiah 23, Jeremiah 30, Jeremiah 33, Jeremiah 48, Jeremiah 49, Ezekiel 38, Hosea 3, Micah 4, Zephaniah 3, Zechariah 14, Daniel 10. So they mention all this list, but not one of those verses mentions the Messiah. So what's the list for? Yeah, it could be about the Messianic times, relating to the end of the days. Fine, that's all fine and dandy, but they are not about Messiah. And you cannot therefore use them as criteria of Messiah. That's the problem. Judaism says Jesus failed as Messiah because he didn't do these criteria in his time. But the Bible doesn't say that these things would be done by Messiah. That's my point, right? That's one of the points that I'm making in this. So anyways, I end on that note there. That's all of the material. I didn't have time to elaborate anything, but I got time to read it all. But yeah, so I'm really late. I probably can't go do what I was going to do now. But anyways, take care, folks, and God bless. Like I said, I don't care if I cause any members of Judaism to believe. I really don't care. I'm indifferent to it. I know that's going to be like 1 in a million chance of that happening anyway. So I'm just doing it for the dignity and sake of God and Jesus the Messiah. That's simply it, right? Because somebody on earth has to make the effort. I'm making the effort. So anyways, take care, folks. God bless. Thank you all for coming. Good to see you, man. God bless you.